The blood hit the canvas first. 3 drops, perfect circles of red against white, spreading slowly like ink through water. Mike Tyson's back was pressed against the ropes, his legs beneath him but not quite supporting him. Not the way they had for 23 fights before this moment. His breath came in short bursts through his mouthguard, each exhale creating a small cloud in the February cold of the Tokyo Dome. The referee's voice cut through 40,000 screams, but the words seemed to come from underwater. 7, 8. The count continued, methodical and final, while Tyson's hands pressed against the canvas. His gloves, those black everlast weapons that had ended careers and dreams, now served only to keep him from falling completely. Above him, Buster Douglas stood in the neutral corner, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man who had just thrown everything he had into one perfect right hand. Douglas wasn't looking down, he wasn't celebrating, he was just breathing, waiting, as if he knew that this moment would split time into before and after. Tyson's eyes found the lights first. The harsh arena floods that had illuminated his ascension now burned down on him from an impossible distance. Everything felt wrong, the taste in his mouth, copper and confusion. The weight of his own body, suddenly foreign and uncooperative. The silence that seemed to exist between the referee's counts, where normally there would be the certainty of standing, of continuing, of being Mike Tyson. His corner was shouting something, but their voices joined the underwater chorus of everything else. Kevin Rooney's face appeared in his peripheral vision, mouth moving with urgent instructions that no longer mattered. The cornermen who had watched him destroy fighters were now watching him discover what it felt like to be destroyed. The canvas was cold against his glove, cold and real, and permanent, in a way that nothing had been permanent in his life before this night. He could feel the texture of it, the slight give under pressure, the way the material had absorbed the sweat and blood of countless fighters who had fallen before him. And for the first time in years, Mike Tyson understood that there were surfaces in this world that would not yield to his force. Around the ring, photographers' flashes erupted like lightning, capturing each second of his fall from grace in high definition. These would be the images that ran on front pages around the world, the photographs that would define the end of an era. But in this moment, suspended between consciousness and unconsciousness, between invincibility and mortality, Tyson was unaware of the documentation of his destruction. 9. In Tokyo, the crowd had gone quiet. 40,000 people holding their breath, watching the end of an era unfold in slow motion. In living rooms across America, where it was still afternoon, television audiences leaned forward in their chairs, not yet processing what they were seeing. The unthinkable was becoming unavoidable, frame by frame, and the world was about to learn that some nights, even gods can bleed. 38 minutes earlier, the Tokyo Dome had felt like a cathedral built for worship, and Mike Tyson was its dark deity. Every seat filled with 40,000 believers who had paid to witness destruction, to see the heavyweight champion of the world do what heavyweight champions do. The ring sat at the center of it all like an altar, ropes tight and canvas pristine, waiting for blood. The arena hummed with a different energy than American venues. Japanese precision in every detail, from the perfect camera angles, to the way the crowd maintained its composure, even while vibrating with anticipation. This was February 11, 1990, and Mike Tyson had come to Tokyo to defend his title against a man most of the world had already forgotten. The cultural differences were subtle but significant. Japanese fight crowds approached violence differently than their American counterparts, more respectful, more patient, more willing to appreciate technical excellence alongside raw brutality. They had come to see artistry in destruction, and they expected to witness it in the traditional fashion. Tyson breaking another fighter's will in the first few rounds. The media section buzzed with quiet confidence. Veterans of the boxing beat shuffled through their notes, most having already written the majority of their stories. Tyson by knockout, probably early, another challenger added to the list of those who had dared to share a ring with the most dangerous man on earth. The only question was which round, not whether it would happen, but something was different in the hours before the fight. In the locker room beneath the arena, Tyson's preparation felt mechanical, automatic, lacking the coiled violence that usually preceded his performances. His hands wrapped with the same methodical care, his warm-up following the same ritual patterns, but the electricity that normally built in the hours before destruction was flickering. Rooney had noticed it first, the way Tyson's eyes didn't quite focus during pad work, the way his combinations came just a fraction too slow, his feet not quite finding their rhythm. Small things, things that wouldn't matter against most fighters, things that might matter against a man with nothing to lose. The champion's entourage moved through their pre-fight routine with practiced efficiency, but there were subtle signs that all was not well. Tyson's usual pre-fight silence had deepened into something that felt more like withdrawal. His responses to instructions were delayed, his attention seemingly divided between the present moment and somewhere else entirely. When Douglas entered his locker room across the concrete hallway, he carried himself differently than the dozens of challengers who had come before. No swagger, no false confidence, no desperate energy of a man trying to convince himself he belonged there. just quiet preparation, the methodical focus of someone who had already accepted whatever was going to happen. Douglas's corner team moved around him like mechanics servicing a machine that they believed could win, every motion purposeful, every preparation calculated. His trainer, John Russell, wrapped his hands with the care of a man who understood this might be the most important 20 minutes of his fighter's life. No speeches, no motivation, just preparation. The media had written the story already. Tyson by knockout, probably early. The odds reflected reality. This was supposed to be a tune-up fight, a showcase before bigger challenges ahead. Douglas was 29-4-1, competent but unremarkable, a fighter whose mother had died just weeks before and whose preparation had been questioned by everyone except himself. But in those final minutes before the walk to the ring, something shifted in the underground spaces of the Tokyo Dome. Douglas stood from the training table and shadow-boxed in the corner of his locker room, his movements sharp and clean, his breathing controlled. He looked like a man who had found something he hadn't known he was looking for. Above them, the crowd settled into their seats, programs rustling, conversations dying as the moment approached. Vendors made their final passes through the aisles. Television crews checked their equipment one last time. Everyone in position for what they assumed would be another coronation of Mike Tyson's dominance. 2 dressing rooms, 2 fighters, one who had never lost, and one who was about to prove that some nights never doesn't last forever. The first sign came in the 3rd round. Douglas threw a jab that landed clean, snapping Tyson's head back just enough to create space, and in that space, something impossible happened. Buster Douglas smiled, not a grimace of effort or a snarl of aggression, a smile, brief and genuine, the expression of a man who had just discovered that legends bleed like everyone else. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, visible only to those close enough to the ring to see facial expressions, but it changed everything. Tyson had built his career on fear. Not just the fear of his power, but the fear of his presence, the psychological weight of facing someone who seemed to exist beyond normal human limitations. Fighters entered the ring already half defeated, their confidence eroded by months of watching tape, of hearing stories, of imagining what it would feel like when those gloves found their target. The fear was a weapon more powerful than his left hook. It shortened fights before they began, made opponents hesitate at crucial moments, caused defensive fighters to shell up instead of engaging. Tyson's reputation preceded him into every ring like an invisible cornerman, working against his opponents from the opening bell. But Douglas wasn't afraid. The smile proved it. In 23 professional fights, Tyson had never seen an opponent smile at him with genuine pleasure. Grimaces of determination, yes. False bravado, certainly. But never the relaxed expression of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do. The psychological shift was seismic but subtle. Around the ring, cornermen began to lean forward slightly. In the crowd, conversations that had been casual became focused. Television commentators noticed something in Douglas's demeanor that didn't match their prepared narratives. Douglas's jab came again, sharper this time, followed by a straight right hand that caught Tyson moving forward. Not a knockout punch, but clean and authoritative, the kind of shot that makes a statement. Douglas was no longer surviving, he was boxing. He was winning exchanges. He was, impossibly, taking the fight to the most dangerous man in the world. From his corner, John Russell watched his fighter with the expression of a man seeing a prayer answered in real time. This was the Douglas they had hoped for, the version that existed in training, but rarely surfaced under lights. Relaxed but aggressive, technical but confident, fighting like he belonged in the same ring with the heavyweight champion of the world. For Douglas, the moment represented years of preparation finally converging into execution. Every sparring session, every roadwork session, every moment of doubt in the build-up had led to this discovery. Mike Tyson was just another fighter. Dangerous, yes. Skilled, certainly. But human, hittable, beatable. Tyson's corner began to shift between rounds, their casual confidence replaced by urgent instruction. Kevin Rooney leaned close to his fighter's ear, delivering advice with increased intensity. But Tyson's responses had changed too. The nods were less certain, the eye contact less direct. Something fundamental was slipping, and everyone in the building could feel it happening. The smile had been a message, delivered unconsciously but received clearly by everyone who understood the language of professional violence. Buster Douglas was no longer fighting to survive, he was fighting to win. By the middle rounds, the impossible was becoming inevitable. Douglas wasn't just surviving Mike Tyson, he was outboxing him. Inside Tyson's mind, 2 voices had begun to war with each other, and the conflict was tearing him apart from the inside. One voice spoke with the authority of Cos D'Amato, the old trainer who had molded him into a fighting machine. Discipline, patience, work behind the jab, control the distance. Boxing is a sport of thinking. Think first, then act. The measured wisdom of championship boxing, the technical approach that had brought him this far. D'Amato's philosophy had been built on the foundation that boxing was chess at light speed, that the fighter who could think fastest and most clearly would prevail. Control your emotions, control the ring, control the fight, but the other voice belonged to the streets of Brownsville, to survival and desperation and the knowledge that sometimes you have to break things to make them stop hurting you. Take his head off, rush him, hurt him before he hurts you. Don't think, just destroy. The primal instinct that had kept him alive long before anyone taught him how to fight properly. This was the voice that had protected him when he was young and small and scared, living in neighborhoods where hesitation could be fatal. The voice that said thinking was luxury, that poor kids couldn't afford, that violence solved problems that talking couldn't touch. Round after round, the two voices pulled him in different directions, and Tyson found himself caught between them, unable to fully commit to either approach. When he tried to box technically, Douglas's jab found him. When he tried to brawl, Douglas moved and countered. The very indecision was destroying him. The internal conflict manifested itself physically. His footwork became uncertain, his combinations incomplete. He would start to execute D'Amato's technical approach, then abandon it mid-combination for the all-out assault that his survival instincts demanded. Neither approach worked when applied half-heartedly. Meanwhile, Douglas continued to fight with the clarity of a man who had chosen his approach and committed to it completely. He worked behind a sharp jab, moved well, and when opportunities presented themselves, he took them without hesitation. No internal conflict, no second-guessing, just execution. The contrast was becoming visible to experienced observers. Douglas fought like a man with a plan he believed in. Tyson fought like a man at war with himself, his tremendous physical gifts undermined by psychological confusion. In the 7th round, Douglas caught Tyson with an uppercut that sent him stumbling backward, and for the first time in his professional career, Mike Tyson looked genuinely hurt. Not just surprised or momentarily stunned, but hurt in the way that makes a fighter realize his invincibility might be an illusion. The punch didn't drop him, but it changed him. For just a moment, his eyes showed something that had never been there before: uncertainty. The realization that this fight might not end the way all the others had, that tonight might be different. The crowd noise shifted again, 40,000 people beginning to understand that they might be witnessing history, not the kind of history they had paid to see. Tyson's coronation as the undisputed king of heavyweight boxing, but the other kind. The kind that splits timelines and rewrites narratives and leaves everyone wondering how they could have been so certain about something that turned out to be so wrong. Tyson's corner worked frantically between rounds, but their instructions seemed to bounce off a fighter who was discovering that his most fundamental beliefs about himself might be incorrect. The voices in his head grew louder, more contradictory, pulling him toward choices that led nowhere good. By the 8th round, Buster Douglas was no longer the underdog trying to survive. He was the man in control, dictating pace and distance, and exchanging punishment for punishment with the most feared fighter in the world. And somehow, impossibly, he was winning the exchanges. The 10th round began with Douglas controlling the center of the ring, working behind his jab, moving with the confidence of a fighter who had found his rhythm and intended to keep it. Tyson came forward as he always did, but the aggression felt different now, more desperate than dominant, more reactive than calculated. The first minute of the round passed with Douglas maintaining control, his jab finding its target repeatedly, his movement keeping him just outside of Tyson's power range. The crowd sensed that something decisive was building, but even those closest to the ring couldn't have predicted the violence that was about to unfold. 90 seconds into the round, Douglas threw the punch that changed everything. A perfectly timed right hand, thrown with the full weight of his body behind it, catching Tyson as he moved forward into the shot. The physics were brutal and simple, two forces colliding, with the smaller force giving way catastrophically. The punch landed with a sound that carried over the crowd noise, a wet crack that made everyone in the front rows wince. Tyson's head snapped back and his legs betrayed him immediately. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the way buildings fall when their foundations give way. His body followed the trajectory of the punch, backward and down, until his back hit the ropes and his knees hit the canvas. The impact sent vibrations through the ring floor, a tremor that the other fighters on the card would later claim they felt in their dressing rooms. The Tokyo Dome erupted, but the sound seemed to come from another dimension. 40,000 people screaming at the impossible made real, at the unthinkable unfolding in high definition before their eyes. Television commentators around the world struggled for words, their preparation for this fight having included no contingency for this moment. In New York, where it was still Sunday afternoon, sports bars fell silent. Patrons who had been half watching while eating wings suddenly stood up, beer glasses forgotten, staring at screens that showed something they had never imagined they would see. Tyson sat against the ropes, blood in his mouth, his brain struggling to process what had just happened to him. For 23 fights he had been the one delivering this kind of punishment, watching other men discover the limits of their bodies and their willpower. Now he was on the receiving end, and the education was brutal. The referee began his count, the most important 10 seconds in heavyweight boxing history, playing out in slow motion, while the world held its breath. Each number carried the weight of inevitability, the sound of an era ending one digit at a time. Douglas stood in the neutral corner, not celebrating, not emotional, just watching and waiting for the count to reach its conclusion. He had thrown the perfect punch at the perfect moment, and now physics and gravity and time were completing what he had started. Around the ring, cameramen adjusted their focus, capturing every angle of the moment that would define the next decade of heavyweight boxing. This was the photograph that would run on front pages, the image that would loop endlessly on television, the scene that would be replayed and analyzed and remembered long after everyone in the building was gone. In those 10 seconds, everything changed. Not just for Tyson, but for boxing itself. The man who had seemed unstoppable had been stopped. The fighter who had inspired fear in every heavyweight on earth had been made human by a punch thrown with perfect timing and devastating effect. The count reached 10, and Mike Tyson remained where Douglas had left him, seated against the ropes, looking up at a world that had just been turned upside down. When the count reached 10, the Tokyo Dome fell into a silence that felt impossible given its size. 40,000 people processing the unthinkable made real, watching Mike Tyson remain seated against the ropes while Buster Douglas was declared the new heavyweight champion of the world. The referee's arms rose above his head, making it official, and only then did the arena explode again. But this time the sound was different. Not the bloodthirsty roar that had greeted Tyson's previous knockouts, but something more complex. Shock and awe, and recognition that they had just witnessed one of the greatest upsets in sports history. The silence that preceded the explosion had been the sound of certainty dying. For 3 years, Mike Tyson had been the most predictable force in sports. You knew what would happen when he fought. The only variable was how quickly it would be over. But in those 10 seconds of referee's count, prediction had given way to chaos, certainty to confusion. Tyson remained on the canvas for longer than necessary, not because he couldn't stand, but because standing meant accepting what had just happened. When he finally rose, his legs worked fine, but something else had been broken that wouldn't heal as easily. The mythology that had carried him through 23 fights and 3 years as champion had been shattered as completely as his opponent's body usually was. Around the ring, the media surged forward, photographers capturing images of Douglas being embraced by his corner while Tyson stood alone in his, receiving condolences that felt more like last rites. The story they had come to Tokyo to cover no longer existed. In its place was something none of them had imagined possible just 38 minutes earlier. Sports journalists who had covered boxing for decades found themselves scrambling for historical context that could explain what had just happened. When was the last time an undefeated heavyweight champion had been knocked out by such a heavy underdog? The comparisons felt inadequate. This wasn't just an upset, this was the assassination of an era. In dressing rooms around the world, heavyweight contenders who had spent months avoiding the possibility of fighting Mike Tyson suddenly began making phone calls to their managers. Evander Holyfield, George Foreman, Riddick Bowe, fighters who had been content to wait for easier opportunities, suddenly found themselves interested in facing the former champion. The heavyweight division had been reborn in the space of one perfectly timed right hand. Where there had been one dominant force, there was now chaos. Where there had been certainty, there was now opportunity. Mike Tyson was no longer the final boss of heavyweight boxing. He was just another fighter, beatable and human and vulnerable. Television audiences around the world watched in stunned silence as instant replays showed the knockout from every conceivable angle, each viewing making it more real and somehow more impossible at the same time. This was the image that would define the end of the 1980s in boxing. Mike Tyson on his back, looking up at lights that no longer seemed to shine for him. The Tokyo Dome began to empty slowly, 40,000 people carrying with them the knowledge that they had witnessed something that would be talked about forever. Not just a fight, but a moment when certainty became uncertainty, when invincibility revealed itself to be an illusion, when the most dangerous man in the world learned that everyone bleeds the same color. In hotel bars throughout Tokyo that night, conversations would center on a single theme. How could they have been so wrong about something they had been so sure about? The upset had been so complete, so unexpected, that it called into question everything they thought they knew about boxing, about dominance, about the nature of athletic greatness itself. Within hours, the footage would be broadcast around the world, creating millions of additional witnesses to the moment everything changed. In the space of 38 minutes, from Douglas's smile to Tyson's fall, an era had ended and another had begun. The heavyweight division would never be the same, and neither would the man who had ruled it with such complete authority, until one night in Tokyo, when everything changed forever.